Okay. It's too long, but I got the key message. The key message is that the Chinese government actually already thinks and takes housing as one of important part of social welfare. Okay, because they this is the key message, and the other things I actually according to my understanding, Prof. Yu is actually explaining why the Chinese government actually takes housing as a from the important factor to important pillar of the social welfare, because people households can access to good housing, they can live where their happiness will be improved. In a community they can have better social inclusion. And can you help me?
Well, that's a challenge. I also got the key message. The key message is that amongst the goals and objectives of the current Chinese government, what they believe is that in order for the social society to move ahead, and you would have to provide housing as a key critical infrastructure for as many people as possible. So social, actually the word Professor you used is not social stability, but rather community stability. I think that word, in my opinion, is actually very important, because you see things differently when you see that as a social versus a community, because I think the Professor Yu's words is more about looking at this at the family and community level, and these are important fabrics of the society. I think that's perhaps the key message here in terms of why they spend a lot of money on housing, or devoted a lot of resources to housing. Is that right?
Add one key message.
Yeah.
It's not a political thing. It's a social issue, not a political issue.
Yeah. Yeah.
No, I think you said that very well, which raises the question, the political system is so different. Officials aren't necessarily elected and aren't vulnerable to being thrown out if people are happy or not happy. There's a different set of forces at play. Throw that out there. Go ahead.
Yeah. Or
There we
maybe I
go.
should.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I can definitely see some of the challenges and the differences that exist, and it's getting back to that. It seems, I think there's a stack effect that impacting us. And it would be really interesting to see a true cost comparison of when you peel everything away, what the true cost is in China for an average home versus ours. And I'm sure there will be a piece of our expectations in terms of size, access to amenity space will be much higher. And I think we're seeing adjustments in that as we go, but we have a historical mindset of, larger units and more amenity space. But I think because of the affordability that existed through the 70s and 80s, we used our housing as a place to stack a lot of the costs that should have existed everywhere, development charges, and there's a lot of taxes that get levied on houses. And you roll that all in the equation, our expectations, and collectively, you end up with a pretty big delta in terms of the net cost on a similar offering. So it would be, going back to your apples and oranges, like we are comparing apples and oranges, but it'd be great to see an apple comparison to see how much we put ourselves at a disadvantage in our ability to offer, mainly because historically we could have got away with it because someone could afford to pay that mortgage or that rent, but moving forward, that's not going to be the case, and whether there needs to be a deeper revisit to get us to a better state.
Yeah. And the other thing that I also sort of might take away, this is perhaps, I'm seeing this almost like trying to step myself to your shoes from sort of the Canadian expert's perspective, is that you can see a lot of the data that provided by Dr. Pu and Dr. Yu shows like the Chinese housing condition was at this level. You're talking about 4 square meters per person. And maybe from a Megan's perspective, this is almost a homeless issue, right? I'm just kidding. It's kind of like you're homeless you just educated me about homeless is not only what I see, but what's behind what I see also, right? So if you use that lens and, so the overall housing supply or whatever per capita basis space for people to live in China, it starts at there. It starts as a 4 square meters per person, those kind of things. Now it's at 40 square meters, right? But where Canada is, Canada is perhaps at 80 square meters per person, like on average, for like you have an average house of 3,000, 2,000 square feet, for family of 4, right? So anyways.
With a private yard.
Yeah, with a private yard where most Chinese don't have. So I think, so when we're having the conversation like this, the starting point is actually very different. So I think Dr. Yu pointed out that, from the Chinese perspective, what they're doing is really sort of lifting everybody up, slowly, or actually in a quite rapid way. But now we're reaching that point, and then there will be additional new issues and that kind of thing. So I think in that regard, I think Canada is like perhaps a few decades above, but I'm not so sure if China will ever be there, given that China has a huge population and there's on per capita basis, as Ben pointed out, the land is not a land-rich country, so to speak, as you always said, right?
But the quality of the public realm in China, on the other hand, is much better than it is.
That's an urban design question. I can save that urban design question for a different forum. Now, I wanted to go to Dr. Pu, and now, so here is a question. It's interesting because I think you take on that question. Hopefully, I'm not putting you on the spot. What can Canada learn from? Oh, that's not a good question. The question is, what do you think that the Chinese experience may be interesting to Canadians? Because the question is here, is there, what can Canada learn from China? Or maybe, I think you take on that question, and do you want to make a few quick points about what do you think of the interesting things that may, or the approach that Canada you presented may be interesting to Canada, to Canadians?
我就是比较一下不同，可以吗？
可以 ，Yeah, okay. Yeah.
Oh.
Try your best.
Yeah, I will. Then I will seek you for help. Okay.
跟上午议员提出那个果汁的问题，其实就是在看相同和不同，怎么辩证的看这个问题。我也在思考，这个您不翻也行。
Okay.
我觉得，就目前的阶段，中国和加拿大的在住房问题上，其实呈现出来的问题是不一样的。
At present, China and Canada actually showing quite different problems, quite different housing problems.
就是实际上是在就是人口的一个巨大的住房需求释放的过程当中，其实供应是有一个比较好的响应的，就可以看到那个98年到21年那个年增长率是13%，就新建商品房。从这个总量上看，其实是给这个需求一个很好的响应。
Yeah, as I introduced in this morning, we can see that in China, actually the supply is quite responsive to the demand growth.
那么现在面临的问题是因为这个需求端，我们认为已经原来的短缺解决了，然后后面的这个人口增速城镇化下降了，这个需求出现了变化，但供应的这个惯性还在持续，所以现在面临着一个就是我们说去库存的问题，这是中国的问题。
For China, now the problem is that the big, the very large scale new supply of housing cannot be slowed down or stopped in a short time period. The trend is still there. The supply trend is still there. However, the demand actually suddenly goes down. See, because why the demand suddenly goes down? Because the urbanization actually is reached already very high level, like 66% of urbanization rate. And the housing, we will see that the housing condition is quite good now. So of course, with other factors, the demand suddenly goes down, but the supply is still there and it's going up quickly. That's why we now see the housing supply surplus and a lot of inventory, a lot of new housing cannot be sold.
我理解加拿大的问题是，就是面对人口的这个突然的一个增长，它原来的这个供应实际上是响应是不够的。我觉得这个可能就是，然后伴随着房价上涨、住房短缺，是这个问题就和中国是不一样的啊。
According to my best knowledge, the problem Canada faces is that during the previous years, maybe Canada's demand is quite stable and the growth of demand is slow. So the supply system is get used to the slow steps, slow pace. But now suddenly the population with more immigrants coming to Canada, the demand suddenly boom up and the supply system cannot well respond to the sudden surging demand. That's the problem Canada faces. As a result, we see surging housing prices, homelessness, and kind of things in Canada.
所以
Is it easier for China to produce housing because labor is cheaper? Let her finish? Okay.
Yeah.
That was in response to her comment.
No. Okay. Yeah, you should wait.
那么刚才是说我们比较了现在的不同。那其实现在加拿大面临的问题，在中国发展过程当中，在阶段性其实也是出现过的，就是我们在满足这个过快上涨的这个需求的过程当中，也会有短缺问题，也会有房价过快上涨的问题。所以我们可以把视线拉回到中国跟加拿大同样的阶段，我们再看一下。
Okay. Just now I mentioned the difference between Canada and China. However, the problem, the sluggish supply response, the delayed supply, the slow, sorry, how to spell that?
Sluggish is good. Yeah, that's
sluggish.
nice.
Okay, sorry. I try to avoid the so negative words. Okay, the slow pace of the supply or the irresponsiveness of the supply, the problem in Canada actually is China also happened that in the history. So I would like to go back to China's history to see at that time what happened to China and how China deal with that.
就是当面临这种供给和需求的矛盾的时候，其实，就是从应对措施来讲，其实主要的，着力应该是在供应。我理解啊，因为需要满足，当然中国也用了一些需求的手段，我在说。那么在供应端，其实感觉中国和加拿大就是有着很大的不同。
Stop. I cannot remember so many. Okay, sorry. Okay. Okay, in facing with such kind of supply issues, so we should focus on the supply side measures. Yeah. Yes, but I cannot remember the rest.
Oh, okay. So basically, Dr. Pu said that yes, there seems to be a need to focus on the supply issues, and then how we're going to explore the supply issues is going to be an ongoing conversation. So keep going.
就是我听下来是在，因为是这个土地是在开发商手中，它要形成这个建设，它是一个比较长的一个审批的过程。
Yeah. Okay, you can use the mic, please. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. Keep going. Yeah. I'm taking. Yeah.
那么中国，我觉得在这个层面上是不存在这个问题的，因为它的整个供应上，我前面也讲到过，这个地是在政府手里面，然后政府在出让土地的过程，实际已经把这个条件、你的用途、你的容积率、你的整个建筑面所有条件都有了。这个就是把这个地拿出来出让给到开发商，
直接可以
那么
开发了。
可以停下来还是
？Yeah. 继续一点点。
那这个给到开发商以后，那对开发商来说，从政府的角度来说，希望它快建，要2年之内这个土地不能闲置政府要收回。所以从这个最底层的政策上是希望它快速的供应。
Yeah. Okay, so I think this is interesting for Canadians. And now there is a huge difference because land in China are owned by the government, as Ben pointed out. So the developers will get land from or purchase the land from the government at the market rate, so to speak, for market housing purposes. But then when the Chinese government sold the land to the private developers, all the planning regulations have been cleared out for you. So basically it says FSI 5, 6, whatever. So developer is not going to go back to the planning department to say, I want more density because my performance is not going to work. So basically the Chinese government is saying, here is the planning conditions, here is a piece of land. You give me the price, you do your due diligence, there is a condition. I can give you the land for 2 years. If you do not build it, and I'm take the land back. So that's the previous Chinese experience.
那么从开发企业的角度来说，因为我上午讲到过，其实政府是不希望他在拿地端加杠杆的，就是不能借钱拿地，这是就是新的规定，就是房地产企业出了这个债务风险以后，新的规定，在此前它是会加杠杆拿地的。
如果什么叫加杠杆？
就是借钱取得土地。在
okay.
你借钱的情况下，你这个后面是有利息的。如果他拿到地以后，他不快速的开发出售，他这个承担不了他这个成本。所以无论从政府还是从企业角度，都是希望这个东西能快速的形成市场的供应。
Okay, so another aspect is from the developers' perspective, because in China they got the land, and so the developers are mostly similar to Canada. You have to mortgage you have to borrow money from the bank to carry on with this project. So it is actually in the interest of the developers to sort of get the whole thing out to the market ASAP, so that you can reduce the financial cost at least. And so yeah, that.
这个是中国和加拿大的不同。那中国其实供应有它自己问题，我觉得就是这种在区域结构上，比如我们说一线城市，这供应就相对需求它。
Keep going， 我们在听着，我们2个人在配合，没事。
供应相对需求它肯定是紧张的嘛，因为一线城市经济好，产业好，吸引就业也多，所以人想来，但你这土地供应它是缺乏弹性的嘛，对吧？不是说能够无限的供应，所以在这个层面上，就中国的供应问题是在这个层面上。
And so the supply side of the Chinese issues with respect to the supply side of things is the discrepancy between the more developed tier 1, tier 2 kind of cities versus the lower tier cities, which is slow growing, kind of more rural. You know, there is a tiered system. You know, you probably get a little bit sense from the Chinese ways of understanding the cities. So essentially, Toronto is tier 1, Ottawa is tier 2, for example. So there is a huge demand. So there is discrepancy between in terms of demand, you know, in different cities, as you can imagine. You know, you have more demand in the first tier city. So actually, in China, there is still a sort of supply kind of issues, particularly in the first tier cities, whereas there may be oversupply in the second, or third, or whatever lower tier cities, right?
Yeah, the technical term is the low elasticity of supply in tier 1 cities.
Spoken like an economist.
Yeah. 还有吗？
还有可以吗？
可以。
哦，就是还有一个，我就点一下，就是3、4线城市的供应量大嘛，这个也是中国的那个在供应上的这种这个问题，就是跟加拿大不一样。那么就是刚才我说了这个应对这种供求的这种失衡，主要是在供应端做。但其实中国在过去的发展过程当中，因为确实是这个就是伴随着这个需求快速增长，其实房价上涨以后，它有一些就是投机性的就进来，所以它用了一些这种限购的行政性手段。那我觉得在中国当时的情况下，我觉得各个城市根据自己城市情况，我觉得也是当时的那个情况的一个必然。
举一个例子，什么样的控制？
就是限购呀，
限购
就是我刚才说，如果应对这种供求失衡，其实主要应在供应上做嘛。但如果是你投机性需求过多的话，就像炒房这种，那你需求端你是要做一些那个政策的，就是想说这个，就重点是供给，但如果你有这种投机性的就是需求端也要做一些限制。
Okay, so what Dr. Plu indicated is that yes, while the main efforts were made on the supply side of things, but there are also efforts made to having some sort of control over the demand side of things, particularly with respect to speculators and who has bought maybe 1 or 2 or 3 more, units in those kind of highly priced cities. And so I asked a question, and as an example, what they did, and it essentially the response was that you limited the number of units you can buy, and in for a certain period of time.
还有3点，那个就是我觉得就中国的一些经验吧，就是也不一定能够对加拿大形成真正的建议啊。就是第一个，就是中央政府在这个方面发挥作用，因为我们前面说了这个地的问题，其实在中国不是特别大的问题，包括保障房那个政府也是地方政府会优先供应，就在土地供应计划当中会优先给到这个保障住房的土地供应，地不是问题。那么中央政府，要不你先，我再说钱的事。
大概总共几点？
一共3。哦，好。然后这个中央政府就是在投资上面，就投资中央政府会给一部分钱，然后地方政府配套一部分钱。还有这个是投资上面，就资本金上面。第二个是这个融资方面，我前面说了，像给这个贷款就是低息的贷款，1.75%融资上，还有这税收，因为中国的这个税的权利是在中央政府，所以这3个方面中央政府可以做的这个事情去给到地方政府的这种要求或者是激励。
Okay, no, I can say, so the first point and Dr. Pu wanted to make was that, and she said she's very polite, maybe not useful for Canada, is a strong sort of central or federal government kind of intervention or involvement. And in the Chinese case, they have 3 things. One is the focus on the affordable 保障房, right? Yeah, affordable housing. So in terms of land supply, in terms of finance, and also subsidy, and so essentially land and money, yeah, tax, yeah.
还有一点是
the central government in China have strong power to determine the land supply. So the land issue is not a problem. Can determine the low tax and the low interest rate. So such kind of policy things. And also where does the money come from? Central government also give money, and the money is matched by money from the local government. Yeah.
For affordable housing.
还有一个就是我们说的那个保证住房，就是地方会根据它的需求提出这个计划，这个计划要给中央报，也要给社会公布，所以这也是一个这个压力和激励。
Okay, so the local government would have to publish and report to the central government with respect to their local affordable housing plan, so that it will be under scrutiny and by both the higher tier of government and the local communities, and so that when they have the target, people can say, "Well, if this is your target, are you going to do? How are you going to? What are you doing with these targets?" Right?
Okay. 还有最后一点很短了，就是政府在做这些affordable housing 供应的时候，也会借助市场的力量，因为他自己就直接做的这个效率问题嘛。比如说这个配售型保障型，他会用这种开发企业代建，就付一点这种微利给到这个代建企业，所以他不用他自己。
什么叫代建企业？
就是市场的，就是开发企业。
OK，
就是开发企业，它可以自己开发。然后我政府，我想提供这个 affordable housing， 我自己没有建设能力，我就因为它的效率高嘛，市场的这个企业，然后通过给他付一部分代建费，就是把这个事情做了。包括那个，我再说一句，包括保租房也是，就是市场主体供应，政府提供一些，就是充分把市场的这个配置资源这个能力调动起来，来服务于这个 affordable housing 的供应，就这些。
Okay, even for affordable housing supply, the government also can make use of the third party, the private the private companies, they can join such kind of things. For example, the 代建 is that a developer, they have a strong ability in designing and constructing.
More precise language here is that there is a recognition of the government of the efficiency of the private sector, so that instead of trying to do everything by the government themselves, the government wanted to use the efficiency of the private sector by providing some level of incentives to the private sector to deliver the things that they want to do. So I think that's,
Yeah, precisely.
yeah, thank you.
Now can I ask my question? But it does seem.
Do I think I want to give other panel members?
No,
an
just this is a
opportunity? Yeah.
follow-up.
Oh.
What I did hear from Dr. Pu is two things. One is that the price of land is negotiable. So it's going to be easier to deliver social housing when you can negotiate with the government on the price of land. The cost of financing is negotiable. It's going to be easier to build social housing when you can negotiate on the cost of financing. And thirdly, the cost of labor, she didn't mention that, may be less as well.
Mhm.
So that all suggests that China is in a much better position to produce housing quickly, especially and social housing more affordably than we are here in Canada.
Do you want me to translate?
I don't know.
Yeah.
你帮我一下吧，我没有完全精确的理解。
It's an opinion. I think we can leave like that, for the purpose of a broader conversation. I actually would invite the rest of the panel members to, provide your own insights and comments, and whoever wants to take the mic first and grab it.
Point.
Yeah.
So part of the issue in Canada and the responsiveness of supply to demand is that it's taken very long for permitting and very planning and so on to respond to, a rise in prices. Part of the reason for that is there is no real planning for housing in Canada, certainly not at an urban region level. There's no accountability. There's no formal prediction, I'd say, of housing needs in most communities. The federal government is trying to change that with making it a requirement for cities. The Housing Accelerator Fund was that cities would have at least a 5-year housing needs assessment that they would sort of project into the future. Now, those needs assessments kind of have to mirror in length the time it takes to respond. And if it takes you 7 years to build a high-rise building, which we are increasingly using to meet our housing needs, a 5-year plan isn't particularly helpful because you will always be out of phase. So in the old days, when you're just building stick-built and building suburbs and so on to respond quickly, that was okay. But the fact that we're trying to build densely around transit now requires much more foresight as to what future housing needs are, and to shorten the response time for permitting and so on, that builders can build more quickly. So China seems better at anticipating needs.
A little
Canada,
more like the Netherlands, where every time land is annexed, a plan is put forward and you build to that plan.
yeah,
Yeah.
right. And Canada puts like the zoning kind of, when you zone, the local community assumes that land or housing will be built to that zone, regardless of whether that's economic to build or not. So they'll zone something like 4 stories, but land prices basically demand 6 or 8 stories. And essentially that land stays in its current state as a parking lot or a pizza shop.
Mhm.
So we have very, I'd say, bad planning overall and predicting as to what kind of housing would be built under current conditions. But China seems better.
Hey, Cliff, just
Yeah.
speak.
There we go. Yeah, I guess it's sort of building that on that a bit. I think I'll speak for the affordable housing spectrum only. But one of the challenges, because it's been government programs, they're short-lived relative to what seems to happen in China is those commitments are short-term. And it means that capacity that you need to build up, again, building in a corner lot, no big deal. Building high-rise, it's a commitment, it's long-term, and it would be wonderful to see sort of program level mentality when it comes to affordable housing, so that it is it's not about building a project, it's about building a process. And it's building a consistent supply chain. I think if we could have that kind of mentality in Canada, which isn't a ridiculous thing to think about, and get alignment of forethought that we are going to produce X number of units in the affordable housing spectrum. And I think China has a kind of mentality. There's a commitment to a whole program, not just an individual project, although those are subsets. That would be my big takeaway is if we could get there, it changes the game altogether. Because we did go through an experience where we stopped building affordable housing. And with that, all the intellectual property, the capacity, the consultants, and the folks that supported that went away for 10, 15 years. And it's taken 10 years to build up, and we can't afford to do that again. So that more long-term mentality is core to it.
That Doc Mon is have the mic a little closer to you. So before you go, I just wanted to give you guys a bit of a flavor about what I saw in the 1990s in Shanghai. High-rise buildings, 3 days per floor. Construction, only the skeleton, and the decoration is a different thing. So there is a difference in scale, as Ben pointed out. But in terms of relativity, it's but don't be surprised. And I was in New York for pandemic, and I was in the and what is that called? Empire Building. Empire State Building. And I was like, it's astonishing for me to see that building, which was 101 floors in height, which was the tallest in the world until 1971, after the completion of the World Trade Center. That building was built in less than a year in New York. And if I understand it correctly, the design was done by an army of technologists and architects within the period of less than 2 months. It's a structural steel building. Yeah.
But steel is more expensive to do from a raw material and design manufacturing point of view, but it's fast. And I think it's interesting for anyone who goes to Toronto often, CIBC Square, 2 big towers, probably the last office buildings to be built for a very long time. Ivanhoe Cambridge is the pension fund money. It's Hines out of the US that is the builder. They built a concrete core for the elevators, and they're doing everything around it in steel, and they are going very fast.
How fast is that? Like how many days would they build? It would take for them to.
That I don't know. I'm there, every 2 weeks or so, and it looks like they're going really fast.
Okay, great. That's a great point. And now I'll go to Dr. Meng. Any reflections? I promise I will give the floor to the audience as well.
Sure.
Yes,
if I understand right, 2 things we need to learn. So the first thing is the policy, right? Because our law written very differently. In Vancouver case, it's all case by case. It's discretionary, not prescriptive. Nobody understands. Okay, the last sentence on any zoning says it's up to the head of planning. Okay, so that's a very difficult thing. That's the first thing. The second thing is, I think Dan just touched on, if you do the affordable housing or public housing, some form of subsidy need to come from what China did is the infrastructure is always ahead of the game. Okay, so you don't end up, to get all the developer pay for. So even in Vancouver, we have this called a latecomer agreement. Okay, so what do you pay? You cannot get away from even down to 15 years span. Okay, you develop that site, you have to pay for that. 0 lines. Okay. Another word, the single family home up to 6 or 4 units duplex is really bounded by the sewer lines. Okay, we don't have that capacity. Okay, so that's another thing. The overreaching that China are doing so well because they control certain things. The one thing I like to mention, this is Hong Kong's experience. So everybody probably remember, probably that's on the TV every day, the Hong Kong student went on the street. They destroyed subways, all the storefront. They occupied the central, which is the business district in Hong Kong. In fact, that's the social unrest, and which is one related to China is top-down approach. What really happened is the student cannot afford, okay, a roof or a piece of square footage to live. Despite Hong Kong so tiny, the unit size, what really happened before the 1997, when British hand over to the Chinese government, in fact, there is a chunk of reserved land in Hong Kong government's hands. Okay, that could be adjusted, adjust the housing price if the demand get too low. The government can release some of the land to build public housing to control the overall the hot market. Okay, to keep a certain way. What really happened is the few developer, which is the control the Hong Kong the housing stock market, buy out that land or through some lobby guys, can you make that land a park? This is greenwash behind all this. Then they made that land literally a park, frozen. The Hong Kong government losing control. Okay, so it's pretty much the housing market is controlled by four or five families.
So, Dr. Mun, what I get from this is that housing is so important because it ties to everybody's livelihood.
If we have this long-term goal, okay, try to the government need to interfere the market, become much more entrepreneurial. The Surrey, which is British Columbia's suburban city, I was involved into the whole plan. Under the Surrey municipal, they have this ACDC, Surrey Development Company, something like that. It's under City of Surrey Development Company, under city control, but they do the business. Encourage and strategically buy the land, make public buildings and so on and so forth.
Yeah,
so that's a good example. I'm trying to.
Yeah, and I think you used a very interesting and I think very important word, which is entrepreneurship. And I think that may be some difference between the Chinese government and the Canadian government. It appears to me by listening to today's presentation that the Chinese government may be taking more of an entrepreneur kind of role in terms of, yes, intervention, but at the same time, they're not only behave as if they are the regulators, but more of participants, and so that they can,
it's their land.
And
I have one more, the last point I'm trying to add, which is a very small point. All this single family home convert into multiplex is try to solve the missing third, okay, or missing middle. That term is, I don't know, is invented in Vancouver. Yeah, all over North America, because we have a downtown, we have 60-story high-rise building, then suddenly, after 5 minutes drive, you have this 2-story single-family home. You're really missing some kind of transitional density built for like townhouses, okay, 4-story apartment. Okay, so what what I'm really trying to say, I can hear and also I see some recent uh, uh, China policy, which is quite advanced. As all we can learn from it. Is they're not talking about missing third, just one bedroom. They're talking about missing generations. Okay, they want three generations live all together because aging society is coming. The Chinese government don't have money to taking care of seniors. They try to download to the core family. In fact, the core family before was a multi-generation family units. So this is another example.
Yeah,
It
housing.
quite
Absolutely. Housing is absolutely it touches upon virtually everybody's life, every segment of the society, and seniors and juniors, everybody. Now, I just wanted to maybe give the floor to everybody else to see, are there any burning issues and questions before I give the floor to the audience? Or you're ready for the questions from the floor?
The audience to work.
All right. Okay. So I believe you have the first and you have the second. Okay, sorry, I only have one mic, so this is what I'm going to do.
Hello, everyone. 大家好. Thank you so much for this amazing event and sharing your expertise. I will try and be quick. I will ask my question in English. So I'm a professional planner here in Ottawa, and my question is about vehicle parking and housing development. So as we all know, most of us, sorry, currently there's a lot of initiatives by the government at the provincial level with Bill 185, I believe, and the new Ottawa zoning bylaw, where we are eliminating the the government requirement for vehicle parking in lands that are near transit stations or, in fact, in any residential lands. So my question is for the Chinese subject matter experts, how does the Chinese government approach the relationship between vehicle parking and housing? Does the Chinese government concern itself with that at all, or is it the market? And when discussing this with Randolph, he reminded me that, you know, the government is no longer really mandating parking, but the market shows that we still need to provide this. Sorry. So this is land that, you know, could be housing, but it has to be parking, or this is money that's being used for underground parking, which is driving up the cost. Thank you so much, Randolph.
Thank you very much for the question. And I would say I will use the power as a moderator to direct the questions not only to the Chinese guests, but also to our Canadian experts, particularly maybe Dan or Bert, because you are the expert of your construction things. So maybe Cliff as well. Just to do a little bit of comparison in terms of the relationship between housing prices and parking. Is that a fair comment?
But
yeah.
Randolph,
Yeah.
I'm curious too. Yeah. I mean, we heard Anne today say when she was in Beijing in the 1990s, it was bicycles everywhere. You go to China now, there are cars everywhere. How has the Chinese housing market adjusted to the demand for parking?
Yeah. Dr. Pu or Dr. Yu, did you want to answer the question on 这个关于 parking， 就是那个停车跟房子的住房的问题，这个问题是中国的想法是怎么样的？
我们现在就是住房设计的时候，它都有规范。比如说像面积大一点、相端高端的，它100户住宅就要配150个停车位。那么一般的小区，它就是100个家庭就配100个停车位。所以这几年实际上这个停车位问题已经解决的差不多了。那么另外一个呢，利用一些公共的场地，比如说学校啊、公园啊这些，包括道路不影响交通 那个道路来挖掘一些停车位。所以现在在一些大城市，现在这个 parking 这个问题还解决的挺不错。
So this is what I will do. Okay, so I will translate as much as I can the answer, but I also want to follow up a question because I think the question from the floor is not necessary about the answer. Okay, so the answer is this. Yes, I think your observation is right, Ben, in terms of the increase of home ownership and the vehicle ownership. So this is what Dr. Yu responded, and she said because in China and there is clear regulations about the provision of parking associated with the provision of housing. So for example, for higher and more luxury homes, and the standards is something around like 1.5 per unit, and for sort of medium or lower end, it's kind of 100. One unit, one parking per floor, and so there may be, these are talking about new buildings, okay? So there may be circumstances where the housing there is a increased need for parking, but there's not enough parking, and there were some provisions to use the public land such as the streets or whatever to provide additional parking as required. So 这个于老师这个呢，我帮您的这一段反应我先翻了。但是有一个接的问，他其实跟的问题是说什么呢？因为建 parking 的时候啊是要花钱的，那么花钱你造 parking 是不是会影响到你的房价呢？是不是这个让你的房价更贵呢？是，也许说你不要 parking 的话，那么这个房价会降下来一点呢？会不会有这个因素呢？
它是规定，就是如果住宅区它一定要造 parking。OK。这个，然后老百姓要么是买这个车位，或者是租这个车位，当然会增加它整个的开发成本。但是如果不去造 parking 的话，今后会面临停车的这种困难。
Okay. So I asked the follow-up question because I think your question a little bit has to do with the provision of parking may increase the cost of construction, right? And so the answer was not so much a direct answer to that, but under the current circumstances in the Chinese market, it appears that parking demand is there, so that the government, the current priority is actually to make the demand to meet the current demand. So that's the current policies. And I would like to invite our Canadian side of experts, whoever wanted to,
question. And
use the mic, please, because you're in the middle of the two.
Okay.
Yeah.
Professor, you covered new neighborhoods that were built after 2000s, but I have to be very honest to other experts and audience. If you have the chance to walk into an older residential neighborhood that was built before 2000s, you will see significant challenge of parking space. So you're walking on a very narrow neighborhood street or alley. You have cars parked on both sides and another car coming towards you. So I don't know, for our Canadian colleagues, do you play dodgeball? You have to use that skill. That's everything. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll just say parking is hugely expensive to build, depending on the circumstance. Call it $50,000 a stall. We have seen parking requirements ratchet down over the years, and so happy to see what Bill 185 brought out. Funny story. I've been at Minto for 20 years, and about 10 years ago, someone got the job of going through all of our old condo projects and selling all the unsold parking, because we had to build all of this parking to get our approvals, and it wasn't taken up by the market. And it was literally someone's job to clean up. We called them the lazy assets. And we had a couple of hundred parking stalls that we needed to sell. It's costly, it adds time. And I'd say, I think about some of the planning things that can really help on affordability. I think of what you talked about, Broadway, and so we bought some land in Broadway in the Canby corridor in Vancouver, And if you're willing to do a rental building as opposed to a condo building, they'll give you density bonuses, not inclusionary zoning, an outright bonus. And if you're willing to do 20% of your building at the city's affordable rates, you get waiver of certain development charges and no parking requirements on those units. And every developer in the neighborhood is taking them up on that because the economic benefits are better than the losses on, like it's the social benefit and the economic benefit really work well.
Challenging one for us. Same deal in terms of like it is an additional expense and one you don't want to incur if you have to. And there's been a lot of pressure on us to build buildings with absolutely no parking. We can do that, and you'd fill it with some tenants that wouldn't require parking. That's good. But we are also seeing that there's a segment for affordable housing. There's a segment of the population that the car isn't. It's not a luxury. It's a necessity for travel, for work, and that's how they make their income. So if you get into this philosophy, which we were pushed down partially, that it's affordable housing, don't put the parking, great. You're also being pretty discriminatory. A good portion of the people that need affordable housing need that car for their employment. So there's a little bit of a trade-off there. And one thing that we're exploring, and we're doing at a current build, and I know other developers, and I think it's getting more popular in Vancouver, is to put in an excessive amount of rideshare shared vehicles. And I know some of we talked to one developer in Vancouver who was taking an entire floor of parking and offering free Teslas for a year with access, because it was way cheaper to do that, way more exciting than it was to build significantly cheaper than building an entire floor of parking. So I think there's going to be mind shifts in terms of what you provide, in terms of access to transport versus just the old school parking mindset.
Great.
Yeah, and just to build on that, we haven't said that much about the interplay between infrastructure, in particular transit infrastructure and housing. But, to make it possible in Canada to sort of live without a car, I think our transit infrastructure is still very underdeveloped and underinvested. But I know my kids would prefer not to have a car, but I think we are so, car centric still with our design and our services for transit that it's almost impossible to live with a car, but I think that is the goal.
Yeah, I mean,
not to be like, the cars are evil or anything like that, but for people to be able to get around without that $10,000 a year expense of having a car, as well as, an important goal for affordability as well.
Yeah, I mean, even for the greatness of Shanghai's infrastructure, where they have 20 subway lines, the majority of the population still own the vehicles, even if they don't drive them. So sometimes when developers come to our office, explain to us, we need to have a supply of parking in order to make it sellable, I kind of not necessarily surprised. So anyways, here we have the second question. Introduce yourself and ask the question.
Hello, my name is Jacqueline. I am neither a student of architecture or urban planning nor an aficionado on the subject, so I hope you'll forgive me if my questions have fairly obvious answers. My first question, I have two, I hope that's okay, is mostly directed towards Miss McCallum, although it's free for anyone to answer. Regarding the programs in place currently and in the past to help with the issue of homelessness in Canada, given the fact that observational data takes time to gather and observe properly, what timeline do the organizers of these programs observe to gauge the relative failure or success of the programs? And what characteristics do they use to identify their relative failure or success? For sure. My second question would be primarily directed to Dr. Meng and Mr. Udale, but again, available for anyone to answer. Given what Mr. Dixon and Dr. Yu said previously about using existing buildings to refurbish and redesign to help fix the issue of housing. Given the fact that Canada has currently, I think, about 17% of unused government buildings currently, which would amount to, I believe, 85,000 or yeah, 85,000 across Canada, although it's more or less depending on which city you're in. Which would it be a viable strategy to implement, seeing how it was somewhat successful in China, to be implemented in Canada? I hope that was clear.
So one is about the data, and the other is about the conversion of office buildings towards residential. So I guess start with Meg.
Sure, and the mic works, yay. So with regard to the data, one interesting thing is that housing and homelessness tend to fall in different departments, so things get tracked differently. And that's replicated at the federal level and at the municipal level. So sometimes the data ends up in different spots at different times. As far as homeless data goes, that Reaching Home program that I was speaking about earlier, it brought in this common tool that is being rolled out into communities across Canada. So at least we get that breadth of knowledge. And it's been in use in those communities for up to 8 to 10 years now. But in terms of and truthfully, like the data is provided by the municipality into that database every month. So, you know, I can just log on to a public website built for Zero Canada, and go down into the community profile and see what it's showing, and it'll show me the data for the last the chart for the last 3 years with regard to chronic homelessness. So the data is collected on a regular basis, and the database that's used in local shelters is collected on a nightly basis. So, you know, you can really drill down. You can get a lot of information about demographics, who's staying at the shelters, how long are they staying there, what other programs are they using. It should be linked up across the different shelters, so you should be able to see who's going from which place to which place, that type of thing. It's not a perfect system, though, obviously. There's also a housing database, housing registry for people who are waiting for housing. And that's, you know, updated and reported on a regular basis. So we do have longitudinal data. We do have the breadth of data across Canada. We can drill down into demographics. But who's using that data and what decisions is that informing? That's the part where it gets a little tricksy. And I want to jump in on the second question too, except I totally forgot what it was. What was it? It was conversion of office buildings. Yes, because there's a project that was CMHC funded through a group called HEART, Housing something research, affordability research team. Tool. And one of the aspects of the HEART project was to do an inventory of government-owned sites, federally, provincially, and municipally, so that you would have this like huge database of land. And it doesn't have to be vacant land or empty office buildings. It could be something like a one-story ambulance station on a large vacant lot, like at the corner. They used to be at the corner of Metcalf and Catherine, where CCOC built the Beaver Barracks housing, and they put the ambulance station back on the ground floor and built 254 units of housing around it. So you can take underused public sites, things like the new library, things like Lansdowne Park, things like the Rockcliffe Air Base. There's lots of different types of examples of publicly owned land that could be used for affordable housing, or a combination of affordable and market rent, or privately owned, whatever. And my pitch would be that the lands stay public land and then be leased on a long-term lease for development. Thank you.
Yeah. So, I'll just go on the office conversion piece. It's interesting, and obviously there's a lot of interest in it. And I think anyone who's gone down that path and done the analysis on it, or for those that have been brave enough to go through and do it, it isn't a cheaper way of getting to affordable housing or housing period. But it's a great way of revitalizing a downtown core. So I think for it to be viable for a private sector or and certainly for affordable housing providers, it would have to come with some type of funding with the motivation that you're reinvigorating areas of the town that don't make sense. But just the notion that you get a building and it would be economically viable, there's very few. And some buildings will never, because of the footprint, doesn't lend itself well to residential. Typically residential are long and thin because you want access to the exterior for windows and corridors and sort. And a lot of the office buildings tend to be a different configuration. So when you roll it all up, there's some that absolutely would make some sense from configuration, but would need that financial incentive to get you over the finish line.
Just one other piece on that. There are laws on the books in Toronto that require if you convert an office building, you actually have to replace the office space in a new building. Even in this, so they're just completely out of phase with the current real estate market. So that makes it completely unviable.
Very interesting. Anyways, Dr. Mann?
Thank you for jumping into that question. Thank you for the question. I want to extend this question a little bit more. Conversion obviously is really obvious thing to do. Okay, basically, we're not only thinking about the existing stock, try to convert something else. To extend that point, we need rethinking about mixed use. Okay, so I just pose a few questions here, which has been done in Vancouver. Can you put a university on top of a shopping center? Yes, we do. Okay. Can you share the student parking with academic parking? Yes. Okay. Can you have a affordable housing on top of a fire hall? So yes, we did. Which is, why not? That's air rights. You need to double use. Okay. I think this could go on and on. We have to change some of the mentality, or some of the uses may not utilize air, right? Can we add something else? Can we add a social housing or condo on top of church? Yes, we did. Butterfly. So that's the kind of approach. So just.
Thank you. I have to be using my discretionary power as a as a moderator, trying to be mindful about the time and the great questions we have. It's almost 5 o'clock, so I'm asking for permissions from the podium whether or not I have 3 more questions. I'm wondering if you have any weekend commitment, issues that households that you want to deal with, and you really have to go. Otherwise, can I carry on for 3 more questions? Okay, so question number 1.
I'll be quick. Just thank you very much for an informative day. It's a lot of good information that came through, just a lot of information as well. So we got to process everything. The question is talking about converting office buildings. I mean, the city here, and I can only speak for Ottawa, they've tried to bring people back into the city to minimize the use of vehicles and everything. And it didn't seem to work. And now there's a big push about people going back to the office, going back to downtown. There's a big push on that as well. I don't know if it's going to come back to that. But maybe more on the CMHC, if they've done some research on the fact of, with all the mortgages coming up due and with the low mortgage rates and with people renewing, the affordability, if they're going to be able to continue with that, and if there's any discussions on eliminating the 2% extra on the stress test for the mortgages, because I have a lot of friends that are wanting to purchase homes, but they don't want to they can't afford it because of that extra 2%. So they're stepping back and staying on the sidelines.
Wait, so it's a question about the money and the mortgage. So I think the best person to respond to is perhaps Bert and Dan.
So that has been under discussion. It's not that people have to pay more than 2% more. It's just that they have to be tested to be able to afford a 2% increase in the mortgage rate. So just want to make that clear. And that was a sort of defensive measure in terms of like very low mortgage rates, which basically, as I said earlier, I think made it less credit given in the face of, 1-2% interest rates. So I guess all I can say is they have been talking about it, and it's not up to CMHC. Those are rules imposed by the Department of Finance, and those are done in consultation with other financials, Bank of Canada, or OSFI, which is the office.
Okay, is that a good answer? Dan, do you have anything to add?
Oriel comment, which is, I don't think OSFI is ever going to give up on that spread. And I say that because they
You do or you don't?
I don't think they'll ever give up on it. It is a point of pride to them. The quality of our banking system, the rigor, like the resilience of the banking system during the great financial crisis, a lot of it has to do with sort of these measures that they put in place. I have a sales team that, they go bananas when I say that, but like the reality is that I don't think that's going away.
Okay. Next. Yeah.
Thank you so much for doing this. I think the contrast and learning about both cultures and how things are done has been very eye-opening. My question goes into if you believe as a panel, and anyone can answer, that perhaps one long-term solution that we could maybe potentially have to the housing issue could be educating our youth. I come from a family where development and real estate was a chat in the during our lunch table. At 3 p.m., my parents would wait for us to have lunch together, and I grew up with that in my head. I didn't understand it fully back then. I do now a little bit better, but I think it has guided me to make decisions that I tried to implement as a real estate agent with my clients, and just having a little bit more of an educational approach to how we do things. Many young people don't understand how to even manage credit. They don't understand much about the housing industry, even though it's one of our biggest, economic drivers. So my question is, do you think that, perhaps educating children at a very young age about, finances, home ownership, and even careers that, are not necessarily seen as great careers because they're not, I don't know what the word would be, but it's not something that you see on social media and all that. And, youth is being driven by social media a lot nowadays. So, the trades are not perhaps luxurious, but they're very needed, necessary, and they can do good livings in those industries as well, right? So, do you think that, educating the youth is perhaps, a solution in the long term? I understand it wouldn't be in the short term.
Okay, educating the youth.
I think Dan should answer that. You said there are programs in place now, are they not? Dan, about trying to get youth into trades?
So in the housing plan, there's definitely some money set aside for it. It's one of those areas where I would say they're doing it. They need to do it much bigger and much better, in my opinion. I feel like my 2 cents, like, let's do away with tuition. I don't know how to incent the folks. I'll say one thing that's starting to happen, and we're starting to do it on our job sites in a very limited fashion, but making the job site an attractive place for a woman to be. Because it is really not today, and there's a whole part of the workforce that we could probably liberate to help, contribute.
Just on the labor supply issue, there is a challenge, I think, with our apprenticeship system and getting enough labor into that. It's effectively kind of a supply. Canada seems to love supply management pieces, but restricting the supply of labor into the skilled trades, which is implicit in needing a employer sponsor as an apprentice. And so that, effectively means that people who are currently skilled trades people, it's kind of like housing, the more skilled tradespeople there are, the lower the wages in that industry. So there's a bit of a conflict of interest in that training system. And to the other part of your question about financial literacy and understanding, the importance of investment and saving and so on. So there's a Financial Consumer Association Canada. Anyway, FCAC, again, is a federal agency that's geared to that training. I'm sure getting stuff in school curriculums and so on, but I agree with you. You can't get enough education on financial literacy, and people really do need to understand about saving and the importance of that for long-term financial health. Yeah, just understanding the implications of poor management.
I don't know if you'd call it a education or training, but maybe an expectation adjustment. I think a lot of people, and I certainly have kids who are at that age where they're in the rental market and would like to contemplate purchasing, but they've come from a background and an expectation that they get a house, right? That's your first thing. That's what our generation was able to do. So I think there's an adjustment, because that gap is just so big now that it's impossible. So that notion of that first step is more modest. Maybe it is an apartment, or those types of adjustments out in the marketplace. I think they're happening naturally, but I think that's a hard when someone grew up with expectations. That first step is going to have a front yard and a backyard and all those good things. No. Oh, 100%. Yeah.
Right. Last question.
Thank you. Thank you everybody for the wonderful panel. I'm an architect from Toronto, and came here to get a more rendered view of how housing is developed and how it is implemented in China. I can sort of share some observations, and hopefully in this roundabout way come back to my question to Dr. Pu and Professor Yu as well. Goes back to the question of affordability. I think Cliff, you brought up an interesting point about comparing apples to, or just trying to make the comparison between, how much something here would cost over there. And it comes down to, and this was in reference to, comparing how affordable housing here is applied as opposed to in China as well. And I think the standard of living and how we begin to understand, to compare that, I think there's two probably different standards of living. Going back to the 4 meters to the 40 square meters per person is one sort of differentiation between the two. As an architect, when we do a lot of housing, there's also policies that influence how much something costs. So back to your question about parking, big factor in terms of how it affects the pro forma. So a lot of the times with the zero minimums, with 185, it's been really great, because now it leaves it up to the developer to determine how much parking you actually really need, because soils conditions, all that kind of stuff really impacts the pro forma. And so that was one really positive move that the government did make to really help affordability. But I think something that hasn't been really talked about, which does affect affordability, is things that make quality of living a standard and an important place for people living in these communities as well. And things like in Toronto, we have the Toronto Green Standard, and we have bylaws and zoning bylaws that require, like, say, the 2 square meters per person and amenity spaces and whatnot. We go through design review panels, we have community consultation meetings, all that kind of stuff that they start to add up and begin to influence and affect the way we build our buildings. So with the Toronto Green Standards, you have different tiers of being to bring sustainability and sort of minimize the environmental impact our buildings begin to have on not only the environment but on the communities as well. So I'm just wondering from in China's perspective, are there, and I've seen some planning, master plans that do have zoning regulations that talk about, site porosity and sustainability measures. I haven't really gone into much detail of it. So I'd just like to understand from your perspective, are there, when they are implemented, and this sort of goes back to another observation or comment that was made earlier, I'm not sure if it's saying the same thing. When a zoning, let's say a zoning map and a zoning block plan has been implemented in a certain region, developer picks that up. The ability to change those regulations, let's say I want more density, is it easily changed in that regard to be able to make it more attractive?
So if I understand it correctly, there's a very long preamble here, which is great. No, that's okay. And so the question is directed to our two Chinese experts with respect to the regulations around the sales of the land, how easy they may or may not be changed after the sales is done, right? That's the yeah, okay. 他的问题是说什么呢？就是说，比如说您的那个地给那个卖给开发商了。那么您里面说那个容积率是3，那个这个高度是多少已经定了。那么在卖好了以后，开发商还可不可以回来改这个东西？如果要改的话，容易吗？
改。
OK。
不容易。
So that's a short answer. Do you guys get what the conversation is? Yeah. Okay. Is that okay? No, I know.
It's definitely an architect's question because an architect is always going to find a better way to do it than what the zoning says.
Yeah, and I can if I can dial the clock back to the 1990s where I was in Shanghai working in the planning department of Shanghai, I would say that kind of thing happens frequently. However, things does change and has changed quite rapidly in China. So almost to the degree that is unrecognizable to me as a local Chinese people. Like you guys talk about the parking, cars and the parks and those kind of things. I can tell you that when I was in 1990s, there was no, like, there were cars. Everybody, take buses or ride bikes and those kind of things. Nowadays, it's a lot, like since 2009, this is official. Since 2009, China had become the largest car market in the world, and it has just keep growing, right? So it's change of circumstances. Anyways, with that, and Ben, do you want to say a few closing words?
That's actually a nice, we have what can, I guess the next slide was what can China learn from Canada?
Oh.
I guess we're going to end on that note. Be careful of parking.
Yeah.
Be very careful of parking. One of the other things I
think we can park here and then move forward.
We can move forward. Yeah, that's a lesson you can learn from the West. The other lesson is don't build too much infrastructure all at the same time because it's all going to fall apart at the same time 20, 25 years from now. That's our lesson of 1967 Montreal. 30 years later, 40 years later, it all fell.
50.
So, yeah, and that was also a lesson for the Netherlands. It's one thing to find capital to build, to operate, but finding life cycle, oh my God, governments are not going to be willing to throw huge amounts of money at aging buildings. And so you want to be careful about that as well. So anyway, those are maybe a few things that Canada can learn from. No, China can learn from Canada. Anyway, I'm going to take this opportunity just to thank our audience, but especially our panelists. This was, as I mentioned earlier, intended as a conversation among experts. I found the conversation to be incredibly stimulating. We were going to end with a question about what do we do with this? I think we're capturing all this data. So we will talk among ourselves, but are very open to your suggestions about how we gather and distribute the information that we got here. I noticed Professor Yu is taking screenshots of my screen with her camera. We'll make sure the PowerPoints are available to everybody and share that information because some amazing information was exchanged here. So really an amazing thanks to our three colleagues from China who came all the way to be with us and participate. Thanks to the embassy for that. Thanks to Ling, who came all the way from Vancouver, Joe, who came all the way from Waterloo, which is fantastic, and to Cliff and to Meg and to Dan for spending so much time with us today. I know we're all incredibly busy. Meg had a board meeting early this morning. And as she said, she's just hit the ground running, so we really appreciate it. Yeah, and sorry, you're
Volunteers.
Oh, no, well, before that,
Oh, no,
a great thanks to Randolph for being my co-moderator today.
Thanks to the city of Ottawa for allowing me to do that.
Exactly,
Yeah.
yes. Yeah, we're very fortunate. So, and thanks to Chris from ULI, who's been, apparently we're being shared on social media continuously over the course of the day. So hopefully that's okay. And again, thanks to all the volunteers, Iben, Jack, Hao Qian, if you're still here, and Hu Hua's not paying any attention to me, but that's okay. And to Hu Hua himself, Tonton, it's great to see you here. Thanks to Ray Chen for coming all the way from China to be part of this. So it's just fantastic that you're here. Thank you all, and have a wonderful weekend. Yeah. Ciao, Rachel, sorry.